He thought humiliating her would be effortless, but in less than 10 minutes, the entire room would remember his name for all the wrong reasons. The lecture hall at Westbridge University shimmered under rows of fluorescent lights, polished oak desks arranged in perfect symmetry, the air thick with quiet anticipation and academic pride. Students filled every seat, laptops open, notebooks ready, eyes fixed on the front where Dr. Victor Hale stood like a man who had never once doubted himself. His tailored charcoal suit fit him with surgical precision, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light as he scanned the room with a subtle, practiced arrogance. Hale wasn't just a professor. He was a reputation, a name whispered with equal parts admiration and fear, known for dismantling arguments and, occasionally, the people who dared to make them. And today, he was in rare form. As he spoke about advanced theoretical models, his voice carried the crisp authority of someone who expected silence and received it without question. Every equation he wrote on the board seemed less like an explanation and more like a declaration. Final, untouchable, absolute. Near the back of the room, almost invisible against the polished rows of ambition, sat Clara Whitmore. Her presence was easy to overlook, almost deliberately so. She wore a faded beige cardigan over a simple white blouse, the kind of outfit that blended into backgrounds and escaped notice. A worn leather notebook rested on her lap, its edges softened by time, her pen moving quietly across the page with steady precision. She didn't type. She didn't whisper. She simply listened. If anyone had noticed her at all, they might have assumed she was auditing the class, or perhaps misplaced in a room that demanded sharper edges and louder voices. But Clara's eyes told a different story, calm, focused, unwavering, as if she were not just following the lecture, but measuring it. Hale turned from the board, brushing chalk dust from his hands, his gaze sweeping the room for the familiar signs of submission, nodding heads, scribbling pens, silent agreement. And then it paused, just for a fraction of a second. On her, Clara didn't look away. She didn't lower her eyes or shift uncomfortably like the others might have. She simply met his gaze with quiet steadiness, her expression unreadable. Something about that stillness lingered, just enough to irritate. Hale continued, his tone sharpening ever so slightly, as though the room needed to be reminded who was in control. The equations grew more complex, the language more layered, each sentence building a structure that only he seemed to fully command. And then, just as he concluded a particularly intricate explanation, it happened. Clara raised her hand. Not abruptly, not hesitantly, just a small, deliberate motion that cut through the room like a subtle crack in glass. A few students glanced back, curiosity flickering across their faces. Hale paused mid-sentence, his brow tightening almost imperceptibly. He wasn't used to being interrupted, certainly not by someone like her. For a moment, the room held its breath. And though no one could have explained why, there was a quiet, unspoken sense that something had just shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself until it's far too late to stop. Dr. Victor Hale tilted his head slightly, studying her raised hand as though it were an anomaly that needed immediate correction. The room remained still, the faint hum of the overhead lights suddenly louder than before, as if even the air was waiting for his response. He adjusted his glasses with deliberate slowness, buying just enough time to reassert control. Yes, he said at last, his voice smooth but edged with condescension. You have a question. Clara lowered her hand, but did not stand. Her voice, when it came, was calm, measured, and unexpectedly clear. In your fourth step, she said, referring to the equation still written across the board, the variable substitution seems to assume continuity where the boundary conditions do not support it. Would that not create an inconsistency in the final model? A subtle ripple moved through the room. A few students exchanged glances, unsure whether they had heard correctly. Hale's expression did not change immediately, but something behind his eyes shifted, like a door quietly closing. He let out a soft chuckle, the kind that signaled dismissal rather than amusement. That is a rather advanced observation, he replied, his tone sharpening just enough to draw attention. May I ask your name? Clara Whitmore, she answered. And your department, Miss Whitmore. There was the slightest pause, just long enough to be noticed. I am not part of a department, she said simply. I work in administrative support. This time, the ripple turned into something more defined. A few quiet laughs broke out near the front rows, quickly stifled, but not entirely hidden. Hale nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion he had already decided to believe. "I see," he said, turning partially toward the audience as though inviting them into the moment. "So we have an administrative staff member offering theoretical critiques in a graduate-level lecture." His words were not loud, but they carried, each syllable landing with calculated precision. Clara did not react. She sat still, her hands resting lightly on her notebook, her gaze steady. Hale stepped closer to the board, tapping the equation with a piece of chalk. "The methodology here," he continued, "has been peer-reviewed, published, and widely accepted within the academic community." He turned back toward her, his smile thin and controlled. "It requires a certain level of specialized training to fully understand its implications." Another soft wave of laughter moved through the room, more confident this time. A student in the second row leaned toward his friend, whispering something that earned a quiet snicker. Clara remained silent. Not defensive, not embarrassed, just still. Hale watched her for a moment longer, as if expecting her to retreat, to apologize, to shrink back into invisibility. When she did not, something colder settled into his expression. "Well," he said, straightening his posture, "perhaps we can turn this into a learning opportunity." He picked up a fresh piece of chalk and began writing again, faster this time, the strokes sharper, more aggressive. "If you believe there is an inconsistency, Miss Whitmore," he said without looking at her, "then I invite you to demonstrate it." The last word hung in the air like a challenge already decided. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the board with an open hand. "Please," he added, his tone now unmistakably performative, "come up and show us where the error lies." The room shifted, chairs creaking softly as bodies leaned forward, anticipation replacing uncertainty. All eyes turned toward Clara. For a moment, she did not move. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, balanced on the edge of something no one could yet name. Then, slowly, she closed her notebook, placed her pen neatly along its spine, and stood up. Clara Whitmore stepped into the aisle with quiet composure, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoing faintly through the lecture hall. Every movement she made seemed unhurried, deliberate, as though she were not walking into a challenge but simply continuing a thought she had already finished in her mind. The weight of dozens of eyes followed her, some curious, others amused, a few already certain of how this would end. Near the front, a student leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching with a half-smile that suggested he had seen enough of these moments to predict the outcome. Dr. Victor Hale remained by the side of the board, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk, his posture relaxed, almost casual, as if he had already moved past the question entirely. There was a faint satisfaction in the way he observed her approach, the quiet confidence of someone who believed the next few minutes would reinforce everything the room already assumed. Clara reached the front and paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze moving over the equation written across the board. Up close, the chalk lines revealed subtle imperfections, small hesitations in the strokes that most would never notice. Her eyes traced them carefully, not with uncertainty, but with recognition. Hale gestured lightly with the chalk in his hand. "Take your time," he said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to sound polite, though the undertone remained unmistakably patronizing. "We are all very interested to see your perspective." A few quiet chuckles followed, quickly fading into the expectant silence that settled over the room once more. Clara did not respond. She reached for a piece of chalk from the tray, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, the chalk poised between her fingers, as though aligning something unseen. Then she made her first mark. It was not rushed. It was not hesitant. It was precise. The sound of chalk against the board cut cleanly through the silence, each line placed with a confidence that did not ask for approval. At first, the room did not react. A few students glanced at one another, unsure of what they were watching. Hale's expression remained composed, though his eyes narrowed slightly, tracking each step as it unfolded. Clara did not attempt to rewrite the entire equation. Instead, she moved directly to the section she had referenced, isolating the variable substitution with a clarity that made the structure easier to see. She adjusted one term, then another, her movements economical, as if she were removing something unnecessary rather than adding complexity. The room began to shift. The earlier amusement softened into curiosity, the quiet whispers fading as attention sharpened. A student in the front row leaned forward, his pen hovering above his notebook, no longer writing. Hale straightened slightly, his hand dropping from the desk as he stepped closer, the faint crease between his brows deepening. Clara continued, her pace steady, unbroken. She did not look at the audience. She did not look at Hale. Her focus remained on the board, on the logic unfolding beneath her hand. When she reached the final step, she paused, just briefly, as though confirming something only she could see. Then she placed the chalk down gently on the tray. The sound was soft, almost insignificant. But in that moment, it carried. And the room, once filled with quiet judgment, found itself holding a very different kind of silence. No one spoke. The stillness that settled over the lecture hall was no longer the quiet of expectation, but something heavier, something that pressed gently against every person in the room. Clara Whitmore stepped back from the board, not with pride, not with hesitation, but with a calm finality, as if she had simply completed a task that needed no announcement. Her eyes moved briefly across the equation, then lowered slightly, giving space for it to stand on its own. Dr. Victor Hale did not move at first. His gaze remained fixed on the board, tracing each line Clara had written, each adjustment she had made. The flaw she had pointed out was no longer theoretical. It was visible, clear, undeniable. He took a slow step forward, then another, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the floor. The confidence that had defined his posture moments earlier seemed to recede, replaced by something far more cautious. He reached the board and lifted his hand, as if to correct something, but stopped halfway. There was nothing to correct. A student in the front row shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by a quiet, concentrated stare. Another student glanced down at his notes, then back at the board, as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed. The subtle hierarchy of the room had begun to rearrange itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Hale cleared his throat softly, the sound unusually restrained. He adjusted his glasses again, though they did not need adjusting, buying himself a moment that stretched just a little too long. This, he began, then paused, his voice catching not from lack of knowledge, but from the sudden weight of being observed. He looked back at Clara, really looked this time, as though seeing her for the first time without the filter of assumption. Your correction, he said carefully, is precise. The word seemed chosen with effort, as if anything stronger might concede too much. Clara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without embellishment. She did not smile. She did not speak. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer uncertain. It was attentive, expectant, waiting to see what would happen next. Hale turned back to the board, his eyes scanning the equation once more, searching perhaps for some overlooked justification, some way to reclaim the authority that had slipped, quietly, almost imperceptibly, from his grasp. But the structure held. Clara's adjustments did not complicate the model. They clarified it, simplified it, strengthened it, and that made it harder to dismiss. A faint murmur began to ripple through the room, not laughter this time, but recognition. Respect, forming slowly, cautiously, like something that needed to be earned before it could be expressed. Hale straightened, his shoulders lifting slightly as he drew in a measured breath. For a man who had built his reputation on certainty, this moment demanded something far more difficult. He stepped aside from the board, the gesture small but significant, creating space not just physically, but symbolically. Clara remained where she was, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence unchanged by the shift around her. She had not raised her voice. She had not defended herself. She had simply shown what was true. And in doing so, she had taken control of the room without ever asking for it. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a tide pulling back to reveal something that had always been there, but rarely seen. Clara Whitmore remained standing near the board, her posture unchanged, her presence neither demanding attention nor avoiding it. She simply existed within the moment she had created. Dr. Victor Hale turned slightly toward the audience, his usual composure returning in fragments, though it no longer carried the same certainty. He clasped his hands together, a subtle gesture that suggested control, yet lacked the effortless confidence he had displayed earlier. The equation behind him stood as quiet evidence, its corrected form impossible to ignore. A student near the center of the room raised his hand hesitantly, then lowered it again, as if unsure whether the usual rules still applied. Another student flipped back through his notes, comparing what had been written minutes ago to what now filled the board, his expression tightening with realization. The room was no longer a place of passive listening. It had become a space of reconsideration. Hale cleared his throat again, this time more deliberately, and offered a measured nod toward Clara. "Your observation highlights an important nuance," he said, choosing his words carefully, as though each one needed to be weighed before it could be spoken. "It appears there is, in fact, a condition under which the substitution requires refinement." The phrasing was technical, precise, but it carried something deeper beneath it. A concession, not complete, not open, but undeniable. Clara met his words with the same quiet steadiness she had maintained from the beginning. She did not step forward. She did not elaborate. She allowed the truth to stand where it was. Hale glanced once more at the board, then back at the audience, as if recalibrating the role he needed to play in this new version of the room. "Academic progress," he continued, "often depends on the willingness to question established assumptions." This time, there was no laughter, no whispers, only attentive silence. And within that silence, something subtle but powerful took shape. Respect, not granted by authority, but earned through clarity. A student in the front row slowly closed his laptop, no longer typing, his focus fully fixed on Clara. Another student straightened in her seat, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet admiration she had not expected to feel. The shift was not loud, but it was complete. Hale stepped aside once more, this time without hesitation, giving Clara a clear path back to her seat. The gesture was small, almost routine, but in the context of everything that had just happened, it carried weight. Clara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the space, then turned and began to walk back down the aisle. The same measured steps, the same unhurried pace. But now, every eye followed her with a different understanding. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, only a deep, collective awareness that something had changed. As she reached her seat, she picked up her notebook, opened it to the same page, and gently placed her pen against the paper. For a brief moment, she paused, her gaze resting not on the board, but somewhere just beyond it, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. Then she began to write again, and in that quiet return to simplicity, the room finally understood what it had witnessed. Not a performance, not a challenge, but the quiet power of someone who never needed to prove anything at all. The lecture did not end when the clock reached its mark. It lingered, suspended in a quiet tension that no syllabus had prepared for. Dr. Victor Hale turned back toward the board once more, as if attempting to reclaim the rhythm of the class, but the cadence had changed. His voice resumed, steady on the surface, yet stripped of the sharp edge that once defined it. He began to walk through the revised equation, now incorporating the correction that had been placed there not by him, but by someone he had nearly dismissed. Each explanation came more carefully, more deliberately, as though he were choosing clarity over authority for the first time in a long while. The students followed closely, but their attention no longer belonged solely to him. It moved, subtly but unmistakably, between the professor at the front and the quiet woman seated in the back. Clara Whitmore continued to write in her notebook, her pen gliding across the page with the same calm precision as before, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet every so often, a student would glance over their shoulder, drawn not by spectacle, but by the quiet gravity she now carried. Hale paused midway through a sentence, his eyes briefly scanning the room, noticing the shift he could not fully control. For years, he had commanded attention through certainty, through the unspoken understanding that his word was final. But now, that certainty had been interrupted, not by defiance, but by accuracy. And accuracy, he realized, demanded acknowledgement. He set the chalk down and turned fully toward the class, his posture straight, but less rigid than before. "It is important," he said, his voice measured, "that we remain open to refinement, even in areas we consider well established." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that had not existed earlier. A few students nodded, not out of habit, but with genuine understanding. The room had changed its language. It was no longer about who spoke the loudest, but who spoke with clarity. Near the back, Clara paused her writing for a brief moment, her eyes lifting toward the board, then toward Hale, not with challenge, but with quiet acknowledgement. There was no need for further demonstration. The point had already been made. Hale met her gaze for just a second, a fleeting moment that carried more meaning than any extended lecture. In that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not conflict, but recognition. He turned away first, returning to the board, continuing the lecture with a tone that, while still authoritative, now carried a trace of humility. The remaining minutes unfolded differently. Questions, when asked, were met with consideration rather than dismissal. Explanations became conversations rather than declarations. And though no one announced it, everyone felt it. The structure of the room had shifted. When the class finally came to an end, the usual sounds of closing laptops and gathering belongings returned, but they were softer, more thoughtful. Students stood slowly, some lingering for a moment longer than usual, as if reluctant to leave the space where something real had happened. Clara closed her notebook gently, placing her pen inside with care, then rose from her seat. She moved toward the aisle once more, her steps as quiet as when she had first entered, yet now they carried a different kind of presence. Not louder, not heavier, just undeniable. And as she walked past rows of students who now watched her with quiet respect, the room did not need applause to understand what had changed. It had already been written, clearly and precisely, where everyone could see it. The hallway outside the lecture hall carried a low hum of voices, but unlike the usual hurried conversations about assignments and deadlines, there was a different energy in the air, something slower, more deliberate. Students gathered in small clusters, their words quieter, their expressions thoughtful, as if each of them was still processing what they had just witnessed. A few lingered near the door, glancing back inside as though expecting the scene to replay itself, but the room had already settled into stillness. Clara Whitmore stepped out among them, her movements unchanged, her presence calm and unassuming, yet now impossible to overlook. Conversations faltered as she passed, not out of discomfort, but out of a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken aloud. A student near the doorway shifted his weight, then spoke before he could second-guess himself. "Excuse me," he said, his voice careful, almost tentative. Clara paused, turning slightly toward him, her expression open but reserved. What you did in there," he continued, searching for the right words, "was incredible." Clara held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not dismissive, not proud, simply acknowledging the statement without expanding on it. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady, before continuing down the hallway. Behind her, the student watched her go, his earlier certainty about the world around him quietly reshaped. Inside the lecture hall, Dr. Victor Hale remained alone for a moment longer than usual. The board still held the revised equation, its clarity almost stark against the empty rows of seats. He stood a few feet away from it, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his posture no longer commanding, but reflective. For years, he had built his identity on mastery, on the belief that knowledge was something to be delivered, not questioned. But what had happened in that room was not a challenge to his intelligence. It was a challenge to his certainty, and that distinction lingered. He stepped closer to the board, studying the correction once more, not as something imposed upon him, but as something that had revealed a gap he had not seen. His reflection faintly appeared in the polished surface behind the chalk lines, a subtle reminder that the moment had not just been about the equation. It had been about him. A quiet breath escaped him, not of frustration, but of recognition. Outside, the hallway began to empty, the rhythm of the day pulling students back into their routines. Clara moved through it without urgency, her steps steady, her gaze forward. She reached the exit doors, the afternoon light spilling in through the glass, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. For a brief moment, she paused, her hand resting lightly against the cool metal handle, as if acknowledging the transition from one space to another. Then she stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of early fall, leaves just beginning to turn along the edges of the campus pathways. Students passed by, some in conversation, others lost in thought, but a few glanced her way, their expressions subtly changed. Not curiosity, not judgment, recognition. Clara continued forward, blending once more into the quiet rhythm of the campus, her presence returning to something simple, something unremarkable on the surface. But the space she had just left behind would not return to what it had been. And somewhere inside that lecture hall, the echo of a single, precise correction continued to speak louder than anything that had been said before. The next morning, the campus carried a quiet shift that no announcement had declared, but everyone seemed to feel. Conversations in hallways paused for half a second longer when Clara Whitmore passed, not out of awkwardness, but out of recognition that had settled overnight. The story had traveled, not loudly, not exaggerated, but with a clarity that made it difficult to distort. A correction made in a lecture hall had become something more than a technical moment. It had become a reference point. Inside his office, Dr. Victor Hale stood by the large window overlooking the central quad, his coffee untouched on the desk behind him. The early sunlight filtered through the glass, casting long lines across the floor, but his attention remained elsewhere. A printed copy of his lecture notes lay open, the same section marked with a pen, the same substitution that now looked different in a way it never had before. He read through it again, slower this time, not as a defense, but as an examination. The flaw was subtle, almost elegant in the way it had hidden in plain sight. And what unsettled him was not that it existed, but that someone outside his expected circle had seen it so clearly. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. "Come in," he said, his voice steady, though quieter than usual. A junior faculty member stepped inside, holding a tablet, his expression a mix of curiosity and careful respect. "Professor," he began, "there has been some discussion about yesterday's lecture." Hale turned slightly, his gaze measured. "Discussion," he repeated. The faculty member nodded. "Some of the graduate students have been reviewing the correction. There is interest in expanding the model based on that adjustment." He hesitated, then added, "It is gaining attention." Hale remained silent for a moment, absorbing the words, not as a threat, but as confirmation of something already understood. Attention, in his world, had always followed authority. Now, it was following accuracy. "I see," he said finally, his tone composed. "Thank you for letting me know." When the door closed again, the room returned to its quiet, but it no longer felt the same. Hale moved back to his desk, picking up the pen, his fingers resting against it, as if considering something beyond the page. For the first time in a long while, he was not preparing to teach. He was preparing to revise. Across campus, Clara walked along a tree-lined path, the leaves above her shifting gently in the breeze, sunlight breaking through in soft patterns across the pavement. She carried the same worn notebook, held close to her side, her pace steady, her presence unchanged. A group of students approached from the opposite direction, their conversation fading slightly as they recognized her. One of them offered a small nod, another a quiet smile. Clara acknowledged them with the same calm simplicity she had always carried, never lingering, never drawing attention, yet leaving an impression that did not fade. As she continued forward, the world around her moved as it always had, but something subtle had shifted beneath it. Not in her, in them. And back in that lecture hall, though empty now, the board had been wiped clean, the chalk dust brushed away, the visible evidence removed. But the understanding remained, settled into the minds of those who had been there. And for Dr. Victor Hale, standing alone in his office with a pen poised above his notes, the lesson was no longer theoretical. It was personal, and it was only just beginning. 3 days later, the lecture hall filled again, but this time, the atmosphere was different before a single word was spoken. Students took their seats with a quiet awareness, their conversations softer, their attention already focused. The polished desks, the bright lights, the familiar structure of the room remained unchanged, yet something beneath it had shifted in a way that could not be reset. Dr. Victor Hale entered as he always did, his posture straight, his presence composed, but there was a subtle difference in the way he paused at the front of the room, his gaze moving across the students not as an audience to command, but as individuals to engage. He placed his notes on the desk, but did not open them immediately. Instead, he turned toward the board, picking up a piece of chalk with measured care. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual, "I would like to revisit a point from our previous lecture." The room grew still, not out of habit, but out of attention. He wrote a simplified version of the equation, the corrected form now integrated seamlessly into the structure, no longer an interruption, but part of the foundation. There was no hesitation in his movements, but there was something new in their intention. He stepped back, looking at the board for a moment, then turned toward the room. "Knowledge," he continued, "is not defined by who presents it, but by its accuracy." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled into the space between him and the students. A few heads nodded slowly, not in agreement with him, but in recognition of something larger than the lecture itself. Near the back, Clara Whitmore sat in her usual place, her notebook open, her pen resting lightly in her hand. She had not moved forward. She had not changed her position. Yet the room had adjusted around her without being asked. Hale's eyes found her for a brief moment, not lingering, not demanding, but acknowledging. It was not an apology. It was something quieter, something more enduring. He continued the lecture, but the rhythm had changed. When a student raised a question, he listened fully before responding. When uncertainty appeared, he addressed it without dismissing it. The authority he carried had not disappeared, but it had transformed, no longer built on being unquestioned, but on being willing to question. The students responded in kind. Their attention sharpened, their engagement deeper, their respect no longer automatic, but earned in real time. Clara wrote steadily, her movements unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same quiet simplicity. She did not seek recognition. She did not need to. The room had already given it. As the lecture came to a close, there was no lingering tension, no unresolved silence. Instead, there was a sense of completion, of something understood not just intellectually, but personally. Students gathered their belongings, but many remained seated for a moment longer, as if holding on to the clarity that had settled over the room. Hale placed the chalk back on the tray, his hand resting there briefly before he turned away. He did not look at Clara again, but he did not need to. The lesson had already been exchanged. Clara closed her notebook, placing her pen carefully inside, her movements as calm as they had always been. She stood and made her way toward the exit, her steps quiet, her presence once again blending into the flow of the hallway beyond. But this time, the world did not overlook her. It adjusted, and as the door closed behind her, the room remained still for just a moment longer, as if honoring something that could not be written on the board. Because that day, no one remembered the mistake that had been corrected. They remembered the silence that followed it, and the quiet reminder that understanding does not belong to titles, but to those who carry it with humility.